and convince you of. So I don't know where you want to start necessarily. But yeah, I suppose my original stance would be. So for the record, actually, I don't think it's a good idea to feed a fennec fox a vegan diet. Everything I've looked into suggests that it's probably quite a bad idea, and it will lead to an unhealthy fox. They eat something like 90% meat in the wild, from what I've read. Um, but it just seems very strange to me that people care about the kind of suffering of a fox and not the suffering of all the farm animals. So I don't know how you want to respond to that, but feel free. It's a free-form debate, so respond however you see fit. Hello?
Yeah, I think I almost lost you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Did you hear what I said?
So
Oh, the the connection's not great. You're stuttering a lot.
I am on the desk. I try to do that so I can talk louder, but that didn't work so well for the network.
Sure. A lot of that was very stuttery. Can you just speak again? I know we tested this earlier and it was fine, so this is kind of annoying, but guess it's bound to happen.
Yes, I don't know. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well now?
Yeah,
Does
that's
it
better.
still stutter or?
Yeah, no, I can hear you better now.
I'm okay. Great.
So
I'm sorry.
no, that's completely fine. So do you want to just respond to what? Did you hear what I said earlier? The point I was making.
Yes. What was that?
So basically, I just think I find it very hypocritical that people care about the suffering of a fox that someone has as a pet and
Okay.
not the farm animals. Do you want to just respond to that?
Um. Uh, you know, it's. I think that foxes. When you're talking specifically about foxes, I kind of have mixed feelings because foxes are also kind of related to dogs, which are human companions and are also kind of far away. So, you know, I cannot compare foxes and farm animals, but let's say you talk about some other animal like an elephant. In that case, I would say if you wanna feed on it, if you wanna survive, is playing no part whatsoever in your civilization, then go ahead, because you've got to feed on protoplast, and you just got to do it. And when it comes to suffering, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that plants respond to damage. Now, this might seem stupid. I know you've heard people make jokes about it, but plants don't respond to damage the same way that we do. They don't consciously go into panic, but they do. They do react, but if you're talking about conscious panic, we can reduce that when it comes to killing animals by making their deaths quicker. And
Okay.
if you're talking about
So you brought up
if you yes, yeah, go ahead.
So you brought up quite a lot of points there. I think just to speak to the plants thing really quickly, I think the fundamental difference is we have absolutely zero proof that plants are in any way sentient or conscious or aware of what's happening. What we do have
No,
is there's such thing as plant sentience, where plants respond to stimuli, but that's pretty much all we can prove. And I mean, like responding to stimuli doesn't necessarily mean you're sentient. So I think that's a really important distinction when distinct, you know, talking about the difference between plants and animals. If you want to try and make the argument that eventually one day we might find out plants are sentient and do experience kind of like reality in a similar way to us or animals, then that's something we'd have to discover further down the line. And at that point, we could have a discussion about it. But I think at this point, you should go on your best knowledge, and you shouldn't really,
yes, you
you know,
are right about that.
yeah. So
Yes, I
it doesn't
think
make
it
much sense
would
to talk about
be
plants really. But
yes.
just sorry, just quickly to speak about the whole companion thing as well, because I hear this argument a lot. Um, the only reason we see animals as companions, or certain animals as companions, like dogs, and I do agree, a fox is close to a dog in a lot of ways, for sure. Like in terms of diet, their personalities. I don't know if necessarily about like brain function, but I would imagine it's
Not,
similar.
I think it has to do something with biology. I mean, they are quite related to each other, but they are related, but they function quite the same. But I don't know where to draw the line between a human companion and just a fox.
So I guess I would argue that it doesn't matter if something's a human companion or not. That's not where we should draw rights from. So, for example, if somebody, so okay, I think we can both agree that people can pretty much make companions out of anything, right?
That's right.
Okay, so if somebody was arbitrarily attached to, say, a chair, and that was their particular companion, would you have any issue
Yeah.
with that person mistreating that chair?
Now, this idea of companionship is not about emotion or feelings. This idea of companionship about the ethical obligation that you have towards an animal when they play a specific role in your civilization, in your survival. When it's kind of a symbiosis, you have an ethical responsibility to, give something back. In this case, safety protection.
Okay, so in that case, my question would be: so if you don't consider, okay, if unless it, okay, if you don't consider a non-symbiotic relationship as something worth like cherishing, then I mean, what do dogs really do for people other than like it's just kind of like an emotional connection, really. Like they don't really give that much back in a tangible sense. So where would you draw the line? Because I mean, if you want to look at what a chair gives you, you can sit on it and stuff. It has a practical use. So I still don't think that's necessarily a valid argument. I think most people would say dogs have moral value because they're similar to us in that they feel pain, they have emotions, personalities, that kind of thing. I mean, and the other thing is like if somebody's so okay, if you're saying that you don't want to eat dogs, for example, because people keep dogs as pets, couldn't you use the same argument for pigs? Why do I mean I don't know if actually if in your culture you eat pigs, but over in the UK, over here we do, and people have pigs as pets over here. So if they're seen as companions in that sense, why do we still eat them? That just seems kind of like an arbitrary line to me.
You can, I think you can make a pet out of a chicken even,
Yeah,
and
of course. Yeah,
people eat that.
yeah. So,
But
but this is my
the
point. So, how can you say that because dogs are pets, we can't eat them? It seems like does that not seem bizarre to you if you're accepting that for chickens and pigs?
now you and I are pretty young, so we cannot relate to the history that our ancestors have gone through. So some animals like dogs and horses. In my culture, it's about elephants. Maybe it's not the same way in your culture,
Sure.
but where I live, elephants used to be an integral part of the civilization. They used to help us, you know, carry stuff around. So we have a moral oh my God, what
A
am I
moral
saying?
obligation.
What am I saying? Yes,
Yeah, sure. I get what
moral
you're saying. It's fine. It's
obligation.
fine. Yeah, a moral obligation towards elephants, right?
A moral obligation towards elephants. So we historically, that's something that happened historically. So I think that makes sense, kind of.
So, I mean, I guess how I would attack that is we have a similar thing over here. I suppose historically we've used horses for various things. In fact, we've used, but this is the thing though. I still think this is kind of arbitrary because we use all kinds of animals throughout history to, to do various jobs. So farmers have used things like I don't know goats and like I'm Cypriot Turkish originally. So my dad's from a very small village in Cyprus, and he used to use goats and various farm animals to do various jobs. But at the same time, I don't think anyone here would have an issue of eating a goat. So it seems, I don't know, I don't see how history gives something moral value. And if that's how you want to do things, I mean, I think appealing to history is also kind of a weak argument, just because okay,
It
we
it it, it I understand what you're trying to say. It's not a perfect argument, but just like in the case of humans, and almost we are not we cannot create energy out of you know solar power. We cannot generate solar power and use it for our biological necessities. So we have to feed on some organisms, and we have to use some kind of we have to draw a line somewhere to define what we have a moral obligation towards and what we don't.
So, I mean, I don't really understand what you mean by solar panels. Like, I don't really see how that ties into the conversation as such. I mean, so for me personally, I think the way we should draw morals is by looking at we should care about the experience of sentient beings. So, I'm sure. Okay, you eat meat, but I'm sure you can understand that. I would almost I would imagine that you would almost definitely say that we should care about the animals we eat up to a point. Like, we shouldn't just needlessly torture them, right? We should respect them, kind of
Yes,
give them as good a life as possible up until slaughter. You agree with that, right?
yes, I agree.
Okay, so if you agree with that, I just don't see how you can ever really justify killing an animal, because how do you ever make it okay to kill something that wanted to live? How do you justify that specific action? Because I understand why people care about suffering, it makes sense, but in my opinion, going against the will of something is causing suffering, and I believe that animals have a right to life because they're more similar to us than they are far away. And if we agree that humans have a right to life, why shouldn't animals? You kind of have to give me a good reason as to why, and I've never really heard one.
You are absolutely you are correct on that. No? You are 100% correct on that. But the sad part of the reality that we live in is that we just cannot manage to not kill another organism and live off of nothing. We cannot you know we cannot act like we cannot. Oh my God, what was that word I was looking for? Okay, so we cannot create solar energy biologically, and we cannot break chemical compounds and generate energy out of that. Some organisms do, and that's pretty cool. I would wish for that, but unfortunately, we have to live off other protoplast-based organisms.
So,
That's why we have to draw a line.
so basically, what you're trying to say is that we need something to eat. So, like, you're saying it's a necessity to kill animals for food. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we
So
need
I
to.
find
It's
this
sad.
really unusual as an argument because when we was talking in Facebook chat, you even said that it'd be relatively easy for you to go vegetarian. So if you already see people in your country, a large percentage that have gone vegetarian, then how could you possibly make the argument it's needed?
Because I don't see a difference between killing a plant for food or an animal for food, as long as you minimize that part of suffering
Okay,
as
can you explain to me
as
how
much as you can.
can you explain how a plant suffers?
I mean, they don't suffer. They don't send panic. They don't send panic messages. They don't have them, and they do react differently to different kind of insects who eat them, or if it's a mechanical damage, they would react differently to that. And they do recognize it, they do act against it, but they what's different between them and us is that they don't go into panic like, oh my God, what's happening to me? This needs to stop. So so if that's the problem, it's if the mental panic is the thing that you're trying to run away from, we can minimize that. We can
Okay,
make
okay,
the death as quick as possible and minimize that.
okay. So I kind of understand what you're saying. I still think it's a little bit absurd, and here's kind of why. So you're arguing that if we're going to kill something for food, then we should minimize its suffering, and that's kind of what justifies it. That's pretty much what you're arguing, right?
Yes, if your point of argument is that something is going into conscious panic, we can minimize that.
Okay, so my question would be, okay, if you think that it's justified to kill something because you've minimized its panic response and suffering, then why wouldn't you accept that for a human? Why is it not okay to kill humans for meat in that case, if that's the reason you think it's okay?
Because we live in a civilization and we have a kind of symbiosis running that, you know, hey, another human, you help me out, I'll help you out, and we can try to survive as long as we can. That's the kind of thing we're going for. That's why we don't kill each other. When in the past, in the far past, like Stone Ages or something, we probably had tribes that try to kill each other, the pack kind of thing. Now we're just one huge global pack of human beings.
Okay, so then my question is pretty simple then. If you believe that we should protect each other within our own societies and that's the reason we don't murder each other, and I agree that's to an extent the reason, but I think personally there's a more underlying reason, but we'll get to that later. In that case, why wouldn't it be okay for, say, a country like the UK or the US or any country around the world with enough military? Why wouldn't it be okay for them to just wipe out some obscure tribe in like the Amazon rainforest or something like that? Like, why wouldn't that be ethical? Because they're not part of our society. So what's the moral issue there? By that logic, that would be justified, surely, right?
The,
Sorry,
because
you've gone pretty
the,
robot
the
there.
way we're because the way we are describing what comes into our society or what does not come into our society is not by, you know not by demographics. It's by what species we are. We're
Okay,
looking at if we are human beings, because there are countless places that humans are, and there are just so many humans
yeah, of course,
who
yeah, yeah.
want to live.
But okay, so then my question becomes: so clearly, in that case, you don't actually really care about the society. It's more about the fact that you wouldn't kill somebody because they're a human. You wouldn't kill them food because they're a human. Is that the logic you're deploying?
May if we're talking about the core ethics, the pure ethics,
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get
the
onto.
pure
Yeah.
ethical part, yes. If you're talking about the pure ethical part of the things, if I had no feelings, no personal emotions, if that were the case, I wouldn't kill them because they're part of society. But personally, there's a really deep evolutionary mechanism going on inside my brain that tells me this person is your companion. You're not supposed to
S-
destroy them. They're part of you.
Sorry, you've gone a bit robotic there. What was that last point? Hello.
Yes, kind of the same thing. Let me try. Okay, can you hear me
Yep,
well
yep.
now?
That's better. That's better.
Okay, so I was saying that if we were talking about the pure ethical part, if I had no personal feelings, if I
Yep.
were just one robot, or if I were a computer, I would go, okay, this person is a part of civilization, and that's why I there's a really deep evolutionary mechanism in my brain that tells me this person, you're somehow related to this, and well, that's how we feel emotions and all the release system from. We have learned that you know, within our own society.
You went. Pretty much all of that was cut out. I'm really sorry, but the connection must have gone again. Hello. Oh, I guess the connections. Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, let me try to
Oh, that's better. That's
adjust
better.
things.
Exactly that. Whatever you're doing, that's really good. Oh, he's trying. Okay, he's trying to reconnect. So yeah, this is all pretty standard stuff, really, isn't it? Civilization, historical reasons, part of a society. It's all very, very standard arguments. When he gets back, I'll try and delve into why I don't think those are valid justifications. But I guess the connection's a bit of a problem. Error 304, meaty and not found. Yeah, I can't disagree, buddy. Devon, he said civil society. I mean, yeah, it's the same thing. Like,
I can. Oh my God.
oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, that seems to
Is
be
this
better.
better?
So let me just try and read back to you what I think I got from that. Basically, you're
Yes.
you're trying to argue that basically we wouldn't kill other humans for food because we live in a civil society in which it's just not accepted. Correct?
Okay, so there are two parts to this.
Okay.
What you just said is the pure ethical part of it.
Okay.
But what actually goes inside our brain, what causes us to emotionally feel that, we must not kill that other person whatsoever, is the fact that we have been so used to over I think millions of years we have been, or however long humans have been alive, we have been so used to being in packs that it's ingrained in our brains as a form of survival mechanism
Okay.
that tells us that you must not kill them and they will not kill you, and you must fight together and survive and reproduce as long as possible. And that's why
The robot just came back at the end of that, but I think I got most of that. Basically, you're saying it's two parts. Like, the pure ethics is that we live in a civil society in which we should respect each other's boundaries, and the second part is that evolutionary and historically, as we've all grown together, it kind of makes sense to look after each other. Is that? Am I getting most of that?
yeah, yes, you're right about the second part, and the evolutionary process is the reason that it's ingrained in our minds, in our brains, in our DNA is to protect each other
Okay,
as our
sure,
emotions.
sure, but
That's why we have.
sure. My question then becomes: okay, if that's the case, I'm assuming that's not the only reason you would protect something, because, like, at the end of the day, we protect lots of things that we wouldn't naturally protect, right? Like, I mean, well, animals are just one example of that, right? We there are protection schemes for various animals that are, endangered, for example. That's not something that biologically we're inclined to do. It's just a preservation thing. So, I mean, it just seems like kind of a strange argument to deploy because I think that ultimately, at the core of it, it makes more sense to give animals moral consideration because the only differences we can think of are all societal and evolutionary. The reason, in my opinion, evolution doesn't matter is because evolution's got us to do lots of really horrific things. Like, throughout our history, we've had lots of, really, really bad atrocities that humans have caused, and we can always recognize when we've messed up, when we've done something wrong, right? So, I find it very strange that you would appeal to our history and our evolution as an argument for kind of like against killing humans because we've killed humans in our history like several times over. So it seems very strange you deploy that, and I think just ultimately what matters is more the experience of sentient beings, right? Surely you could agree, like you said, you don't want animals to suffer. So why, if you care about their experience overall, why would you condemn them to death just for something as basic as food when we have, tons of alternatives?
Okay, so here we have this evolutionary thing that leads us to stay in packs and care about some things and kill the others, and then there's the right way to do things that you should care about everything. Why discriminate? So we're kind of stuck between these two,
Yeah, I'd say it's fair.
and that's only because we must feed on other organisms to survive, and even if it's a plant or an animal, we can digest both.
Yep.
And what I'm trying to say is that there's so we have discussed how we have discussed each other's point of views on how plants how what plants experience are different from what animals experience, and how they're different, how they're not different. And and now here comes the part where we're stuck between the right way to do things and killing some animals and not others. So I think that explains that we're stuck in a really bad condition where we just not have a way to create solar energy or chemical energy or whatever could lead us to survive.
Sure. So I don't disagree that we need something to survive, but I guess the point that I think you're missing a little bit is that the argument vegans are making, so I'm Bat Guy just pointed this out in chat, and I've already said it to you like a little bit, but it seemed like you kind of brushed
Yes,
it off a
yes,
little bit. Basically,
yes.
there's no proof whatsoever that plants are sentient or worthy of any sort of moral consideration. Like as far as I can see, plants are effectively about as sentient as something like rocks. You know, there's a degree of plant intelligence, but they don't have central nervous systems. They don't have any brain functions or cognitive functions. So I think it's a fair assumption with our current knowledge to say that plants, as far as we can tell, just have no level of sentience, whereas animals do. And I like that surely puts them in two different, completely separate categories. Also, just to quickly speak to Jason in chat, I don't think it matters whether animals are sapient, because there are humans that, by your definition of sapient, when we discussed this, there are certain humans that aren't sapient, but I don't think we would advocate for killing those humans for food. So that seems hypocritical to me. Sorry, go on. Do you want to respond to the sentience thing?
Okay, so let me address the previous part where you said that how plants and animals are put into two different categories. They
Sure,
actually are,
definitely.
but the way that we farm and kill animals for food is that we do our best to take that conscious panic out of the equation, so that so that we are not under some extra burden of some, doing something unethical. So that's how we do our best to relieve them of any kind of possible suffering. Now, could you repeat that sapient part,
Um,
the
uh,
second part?
I was just responding to someone in chat, but I'll explain that after I just refute this. You've kind of said this a couple times about reducing the moral panic because they're sentient, but I'm not. I think you're slightly missing the point. I think that the reason you're concerned with reducing the harm is because you see plants as sentient, but I don't. There's just no scientists that would agree with
No,
you.
no,
There's.
no, no. That's not it.
Oh, sorry.
Plants
Go
are
on.
not conscious. Okay, so I'm saying that the conscious panic that you worried about, we try to take that out of the equation. Now, the way that both plants and animals do suffer is, biologically. They, if let's assume that, let's take the neural signals to the let's take the neural signals that animals receive out of the equation. Now let's talk about pure biology. So plants detect damage, so do animals. Both our cells respond to that. We try to fix things. Now when you're talking about that panic that occurs in our brain and not the plants, we can try to minimize that
Okay, I agree
by
that we can try to minimise that, but I just want to speak to this real quick. So basically, I find it really odd that you. Okay, as far as biological damage goes, I don't think that's something that's valuable. And here's my reasoning as to why. So, like I said, philosophically speaking, actually, let me
yes.
just quickly define sentience, so we're on the same page, because it's possible that we could be having different
Okay.
definitions. So my definition of
Okay.
sentience would be the ability to experience reality in whatever capacity that may be. That may be that you can feel pain, you have like a sense of what's around you, a level of self-awareness. It may even just be something as simple as kind of being able to observe like kind of what's happening around you. You might not like. I mean, there's beings that don't feel pain but are sentient as such. In fact, that's a condition in humans. But so I think when I say sentience, I'm talking about the ability to actually experience a level of subjective reality. This is something.
Yes, and that's the reason that we try to minimize that sentient pain.
Yeah, no, of course,
That
but
that's
this is what I'm saying. Like, why do you keep bringing up plants if they cannot experience a level of subjective reality? Surely the biological damage we do to plants doesn't actually matter because there's no quote unquote harm being done to anything of value. Like all that's happening when you chop like down a plant or whatever is its biological processes stop functioning. But that why is that important to you? And like the perception of that harm isn't. You know. Or I mean, I guess it is because you've said we try to minimise harm, but surely that's
yeah,
the
yes,
distinction.
that's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm trying to say. That this thing that biological damage that does not matter is the is common between the two, and the sentient pain that does matter, we try to minimize that. So
Yeah, okay,
you
but
know, and
okay, if you agree with that, then there's your distinction between plants and animals. Surely, if you agree that the sentience is what matters, then surely even you
yes,
could see that plants just don't like their experiences don't matter because they don't have any experiences, whereas animals do.
yes, if the experience part is what we're usually worried about, and that's what that's why we're mad about the fox thing, because he's experiencing sentient pain.
Okay, yeah, I
But
can agree.
when you quickly, and when you try to minimize the sentient pain and then try to kill an animal, it takes the sentient it takes the sentience out of the equation. So you've already solved that problem. So
Okay,
I
I
don't think
could not disagree more there. So, if what you're saying is that you take away the pain and suffering, then the sentience is kind of less important. I don't know if anyone would ever accept that. If you just took somebody's random, like, dog or pet or something like that, and you killed it in a very quick fashion, lethal injection, for example, people would be outraged. And in fact, this is something that happened, like, just a couple, maybe even a week ago. Do you know, oh, what's her name? Do you know the Twitch streamer Aquila Gamer?
what I don't know about that.
Okay, so what happened with Aquila Gamer is basically she used to be a vet,
Okay.
and she was on a podcast, and they asked her what's the worst thing she's ever done, and she answered that she killed somebody's dog. Now she would have killed it in a way that was, completely harmless, like lethal injection, and people were
Yep.
completely outraged. Everybody unanimously thought it was deeply unethical as to what she had did. So
Yes.
in that case, they've removed all the level of quote unquote sentient suffering that you're talking to, but people still didn't see it as acceptable and like as moral. So I don't necessarily think that matters. I don't think it matters how you kill something. Like you would never accept this for a human, so why would you accept it for an animal?
Okay. So I think that we are confusing two things here.
Okay,
One of them is sentience, and the other is something along the lines of the the right to live, or something like that.
okay,
So what you're taking away from the dog is not the sentience, it is the right to live. Now let me go back to what we have covered. So we both agree on the fact that biological damage does not matter that much in this
yeah,
case.
yeah, yeah, of course.
Now the sentient pain, we can minimize that. And now the part where we're stuck is the freedom to live. Now that's where we're stuck as human beings. We have to draw a line somewhere on that part, on who we can leave to be alive, and who we have to force ourselves to feed on.
So here's
That's where we have to draw a line, and that's where the part of the civilizational history and companionship things come on. And it's pretty sad, but we are forced to do that.
But this is the thing, I don't think we are. We could live perfectly happy lives and perfectly healthy lives without eating any meat. There isn't a need to do it. It is purely a luxury, right? I mean, it's not something we
Okay,
need to
okay,
do.
so let me point something out there. Okay, so we can live perfectly without eating one of the two things, either meat or plants. So we can live perfectly without eating meat. Now, now the the two things that we have discussed, sentient pain and biological damage, we have taken those out of the equation, and now we're drawing the line. And
We
when we take those out of the equation, we kind of merge
so
plants and animals into one ball of protoplast.
here's where I disagree. Then I guess. So I would completely disagree that I would completely disagree that we've removed the sentient pain. I believe that the will to live that animals have and that humans have, and that is something we both have. I believe that is
Yes.
inherently taking that away is inherently a level of sentient pain being caused. So you can't remove all of the sentient pain. You're still inflicting a level of suffering. You're killing something that doesn't want to die, and that's talking about like lethal injection, like killing something in a way that it doesn't even know it's died, right? If you talk about the way they're killed in slaughterhouses, is definitely not how it happens. Like I'm sure you're aware of this, right? Like we don't lethally inject every cow and I guess not cows for you, but
Yes.
every chicken or pig or do you know what I mean, or goat that we might eat, right?
Okay, so if a farm animal is getting tortured, I'm totally against that. It should not happen.
Okay,
We should totally we should avoid doing that. Now, assuming that something is getting killed the right way with as little pain as possible, you know, when you say that something wants to live and you're taking that away, that will to live is just a really complex versions of what plants have. Plants have it much simpler. That's why we don't relate to them. And now we have this huge mess of thoughts and all this data in our heads. So we have something more tangible to look at. We can tell each other, "Oh my God, I want to live," or animals can scream at us.
okay.
So we know that they want to live.
So just
But
just a quick thing here. So you keep going back to this idea that so for example, the will you're saying the will to the live is a biological process, and my argument against that is that although plants and sentient creatures both have a will to live to an extent. I mean, I guess we can assume this from a plant because it doesn't really have a will. But again, this kind of comes back to sentience, though, because if you establish that a plant's the reason that an animal and a human's biological processes matter is because they experience reality, and a plant's doesn't because they don't experience reality. So I'm not actually saying that biological processes are completely irrelevant. I would say that
yes.
biology is important, but it's only important if you already have the requisite experience of reality. Because if you can't experience the biological processes you're going through, then there's no point in considering the biological processes. Does that make sense? Do you, like,
I kind of spaced out. Could you repeat the last part?
Sure, yeah. So
The,
what
the,
I'm saying is that basically your argument is that we should try and reduce sentient suffering, and you keep going back to plants and saying that will to live basically doesn't matter because plants also have a will to live or a desire to continue their biological processes. But my argument
okay.
against plants specifically is that because plants aren't sentient, because they don't experience the biological processes they're going through, their biological processes don't matter. The reason I care about the will to live of animals and humans is because they experience that will and they experience the suffering when it's taken away from them. Whereas plants don't have that, and I think that is the distinction that means that we should eat plants as opposed to animals. Does that make sense?
Okay. So are you saying that what I'm experiencing now, the will that I have to live right now, is that what matters, or is
So
it the end suffering part?
the will to live does matter, but it only matters because you can experience that will to live.
Okay. Okay. So that does make a bit of sense. But when you look at things objectively, when you forget that you can relate to one species and not another class of organisms, you can see things better. So if you look at a plant, it it sends very extremely simple signals back to whatever system it has, because it can detect pain. It does not experience the level of sentience that we do, or it might not experience that at all, but it does carry out some signal processing. And what we have is just a really complex version of it. It's the same thing,
I
but
don't
it's so complex
I
that it
don't
feels really different.
I don't entirely disagree. I think you're like I definitely know where you're coming from, and I totally see what you're talking about. But again, do you think that a plant actually experiences those signals, or do you think it's just something that happens, so to speak? Because I guess this is the core of our disagreement.
Okay, so I think that they experience, but not in the same way that we do. Their panic is really simple. They don't have thoughts in some kind of language like English or Spanish,
Of
like,
course,
oh my
yeah.
God, what's happening to me? It's just a really simple mechanism. They go, oh, and they do the process.
So yeah, but this is kind of what I'm saying. Like, I agree with you. I would say that the process plants go through is almost definitely closer to something like a computer as opposed to a animal.
Yes, yes.
So, if we can establish that, then again, if the plant doesn't really, if they experience things in such a different way, why does their suffering matter? Like, if they're not experiencing it, it's just a process they go through, then I don't think there's any really sound scientific reason to focus on their quote unquote suffering, because they can't experience it as far as we're aware.
Okay, so let me ask you something.
Shoot.
Does something matter more just because you can relate to it more easily?
I'm not talking about relating to something, I'm talking
No,
about
no,
experiencing
it's
things.
it's it's because the difference is in the complexity of the experience that you versus the plants have is the complexity, and that's the only difference. Now, if something has much simpler processes, much simpler reactions to things, I think they matter just as much as organisms. We might not relate to that. A lot of people are probably thinking that this sounds really stupid. But when you look at things from, say, the perspective of a rock, you, you might start to see things.
Okay, so I guess we're never going to agree on that specifically because, I mean, a rock doesn't have any kind of biological processes, nor does it have any level of
No,
sentience.
no, I'm just asking you to think like a rock. Like, forget that you're human. Forget that you have a certain kind of thought, because what you experience specifically does not define what's okay and what's not.
Okay, I tell
It's
you what,
it's just
I've
means that it's closer to what you experience.
okay, I tell you what, I think I've got a better idea. I don't think we're ever going to see eye to eye on this because I imagine, like, I mean, I could never put myself
Yes.
in that position because, as far as like, it would to imagine myself as a rock would just to be imagine nothingness. So I wouldn't care about what happens to me
Yes.
much in the same way. But I would see for me that I'm the same as it would be the same as the plant. Like to experience what it is to be a plant, as far as we're aware, is just nothingness. So
That's the
it,
thing. That's the thing. It may not be nothingness, because you know
I think you.
organisms that are much simpler than plants, they move in a way that we do, and just because of that reason, even though they experience much less than plants, some of us, when we see bacteria moving, we might assume that, oh my God, they have feelings, when they actually don't. They don't even feel what plants feel.
Okay, I tell you what. Fuck it. Let's just get this entire. Okay. Oh, let's. I'm going to grant you a huge leap here, right? So let's say hypothetically we find out one day that plants are indeed sentient and they can experience the tiniest little bit of really abstract suffering, and they are aware of it to a very small extent. What at that
Okay.
point, if you, because you've already said you just want to reduce suffering as well, you want to reduce the suffering of sentient beings, what is your argument for eating animals over plants? Because in that scenario, if we just eat the plants directly, we actually eat a lot less plants than if we eat animals and plants, because you have to feed the animals something, and the biological conversion rate is something like 10%. So if we were to just eat the plants directly, we'd still be causing a lot less suffering. So what would be your justification for eating animals in that circumstance anyway?
So you, so what do you mean when you say that we would be causing a lot less suffering? Are you assuming that we are going to, what do you mean by that?
So basically, okay, when you kill an animal, when you raise an animal, you have to feed it
Okay.
something to grow, right? And it's typically the turnaround time for like a cow from birth to slaughter. I think I might be getting this wrong, but I think it's about something like 1.5 to 2 years. It might even be shorter. But in that time, they're going to eat like just a ton of plants that could have fed the population directly. So, if you just want to reduce harm, it makes a ton more sense to just eat the plants directly anyway, because the plant suffering won't be even close to equivalent of the cow's suffering plus the plant suffering that we've fed to the cow. Does that make sense? Also, I'm that guy in chat just said that the conversion rate is actually considerably less than 10%, which, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to find out. I'm not a biologist, but I
Okay.
thought it was
Okay.
close.
So let's assume that we are all okay. So let's assume that we have one grass field, and for some strange reason, we only have 10 plants in that,
Okay,
and you have a cow.
okay,
Let's say you need to eat 5 plants. Out of those, you eat 5 plants.
sure.
What happens to the other 5 plants? The cow eats them. The cow has to eat them.
Yeah, this is
So
the point I'm making, yeah.
so nothing, not even suffering disappears. It just goes to the cow instead of you.
No, that's just not true, though, is it?
Okay,
Because
I got that. I got that wrong. It goes to you instead of. Okay, I'm a little confused here. So all I'm trying to say is that the cow will eat those plants anyway.
okay,
It
sure.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you eat more plants or if you eat the cow.
So,
Once the cow has eaten those plants, you have the ability to choose between other plants that the cow has not eaten and the cow that you have. Those One of the two will not be affected. The cow won't magically eat the plants that it has not eaten because it already ate other plants, and it will regardless of whether you eat the cow or not.
I struggle maintaining this line of thought, though, because if your ultimate goal is harm reduction, how could you possibly say that eating. Okay, when you eat a cow, it's been growing for about, let's be generous. Let's say it only
Yes.
takes 6 months for a cow to go from birth to slaughter. Okay, super generous, right?
Yes.
So if
Okay.
you a cow over the course of 6 months won't just eat the 5 plants that you're describing. It will eat something like
Yes.
20. Let's just say hypothetically, over the course of its lifespan, it will eat 20 plants before it gets to slaughter. If you were to eat those plants directly, the same amount of nutrition you'd get from the cow, you could get within 5 plants. So, what we're really comparing isn't the cow eating the same amount as you. It's quite simply the cow's suffering plus 20 plants is suffering versus 5 plants, which is what you would have eaten in the first place. So I just don't see how you could make that argument because it's not the same amount of plants. If you eat the cow, you're definitely giving it more plants than you would eat directly. The calorie conversion rate is really bad. This is like a very basic biological thing.
Okay. Okay. So let me try to illustrate this another way.
Sure.
So the cow has already eaten the plants. Now now you have more plants and one cow. If you don't eat the cow already has eaten those plants. It's not going to affect the pest. You can choose. where to focus your, suffering, what you need to make suffer, because it's not gonna, you still have some plants to eat, you still have some plants and that cow to choose between. What the
Okay.
cow has already eaten is not going to be affected.
Okay, so my question is, do you believe that? Because it kind of sounds like you equate the suffering of a cow and the plant as the same. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly the same. You know, when you take
It
when
sounds.
you ta- when you take when you take the sentient and suffering out of the equation, yes, it is.
Okay,
That's what I've been trying to get at.
but this is my point. But this is precisely the point I'm making. When you take the sentience out of the equation, I don't care about you as a being. Like, if you found a cow that wasn't
Yes.
sentient, go for it, eat it. But the thing is, we can prove, as far as we can tell, because our tests on sentience are very basic, I'll grant you that, but as far as we can tell, cows are sentient. There aren't many cows that aren't sentient, much in the same way there aren't many humans. It's like a very small percentage. And I'm fine with eating those cows, and I would go even so far as says I'm fine with eating those humans as well. But that if they're sentient, you have to consider them above non-sentient beings, because this is the entire foundation of reality. Like, if you can't experience reality, how could you care about that being suffering? If you could even call it a being at that point, really.
Okay, so you're saying that whatever they have experienced is in the past somehow makes them more valuable,
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that.
or is it the suffering part?
Wait, 1 minute. Do you mean like so? I think I know what you're trying to say. So basically, if you say if we kill something and it is completely like if you kill it in its sleep, for example, then the only thing you could possibly value is its past, right? Is that what you're saying?
No, no, that's what I'm trying to ask. Because in that case, if you kill me in my sleep, what I'd value is, that I'm a human being. We have a symbiosis, and
So okay.
you have evolved to feel for me.
So, but this is precisely it, though. I actually don't value you because you're a human. I value you because you're sentient. And the reason I care about not killing people in their sleep is because that anybody who is going to wake up has a level of sentience. And like, if you have a will to live while you're awake, when you go to sleep, you still have that will to live. It's just in your subconscious. You're not sentient as such. You're just unconscious, I guess is probably the best way to put it. But I mean, like, we dream and stuff. It's not like we'd become non-sentient
Okay,
in our
okay.
sleep.
So let me say something here. So you have a will to live that you can confirm by your thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay, so where do you think that will to live comes from?
My biological instincts to want to live, and I
Okay,
mean, I
so
could give you a more
you,
articulated
it's
reason. I
it's
enjoy
it's in
living
your it's in your genetics.
to an extent.
Okay,
To an extent.
yes. So no, because I mean it is. I mean, look at, take away all the technological stuff that we do, and you you can see that it's in our, but it's in every part of our biology that we want to live and survive and multiply. Now, now, don't plants have that? Plants react. Plants try to live.
We're going back to this though.
You
This is what
you
I've
know,
been.
they're not sentient. They don't feel it in their thoughts,
Yeah.
but they do have that will to live
I don't.
ingrained in
I
their DNA in some form.
I don't
That's
think that
that's that's why they do everything that they do.
I don't think equating something as has a desire, or not even a desire, has biological process to continue living and pass on its genes. I don't think I would equate that even close to a will to live. When I say a will to live, I mean like I mean even insects have a will to live, right? They're sentient to a much smaller degree than humans, or even something like cows and pigs, right? But they still have like a will to live in the sense that they can kind of like as far as we're aware, they exhibit the traits of sentient beings, meaning that they back away from bad stimuli essentially. Plants don't really do that. They respond to certain things, but they don't like it's not like as far as we're aware, they have any kind
Okay,
of connection to reality.
so so let's say you might probably have seen some some footage on the internet or television of bacteria reacting to
Oh, robot again.
okay, I think I'm losing you.
Oh,
Okay, can
okay,
you hear
yeah,
me now?
that's better. That's better. Yeah.
Okay, so have you ever seen any footage of a bacteria or a microorganism of some sort?
I mean, not really. I haven't looked into bacteria or microorganisms a
I
ton.
mean, even a small clip,
We, I
just
mean, I know
moving.
what they look like. If that's what you're asking. Like, yeah.
I mean, it's on television, it's in music videos, in short clips. Bacteria move. Now, if you see a bacteria back away from something bad, you would say that it has a will to live, just because it reacts the same way that you do. When in fact, the bacteria has less sentient experience than plants do. If we actually do have a level for sentient experience, bacteria experience less than plants do. The only difference is that plants don't back away or react to the stimuli, because they don't have the organs, or maybe they never needed to evolve into that.
I mean, okay, so it's possible that I may have used a bad example. Like maybe bugs aren't. Like maybe there's certain bugs that aren't sentient, and I mean, I wouldn't even be too surprised if, like, I mean, I think you would have to show me something outside of this debate to prove to me that plants are more sentient than bacteria. I actually find that kind of hard to believe, honestly. I would say they're
No,
probably
it's very
as.
simple. So if you look at the biology, both plants and bacteria have, all the basic stuff. The reason that we as humans experience more than plants is that we have a whole bunch of cells constantly sending signals and interacting, and we experience that entire sum of those processes as our thoughts. Now, if you compare a plant to a bacteria is just one cell. So it's just one nucleus that does all the processes, and some other stuff going on inside the cell. And has a plant is closer to us humans than a bacteria is, because it has multiple cells constantly interacting and reacting to any damage, stuff like that.
Okay,
They
so
react. They have.
I don't even necessarily. I mean, like that might be true, but regardless, if that's the case, I wouldn't push towards plant sentience or plant experiences being worth anything. I would just suggest that bacteria experiences aren't worth anything, because if we know that
Yes.
bacteria is on the same level as plants, I would suggest they're just both not sentient. I mean, like until you can give me again solid like evidence that there's like again, no scientist would ever say that plants are sentient. It's just not something that's ever been agreed upon or even like really studied because plant intelligence is one thing, but plant sentience it just there's no evidence
No,
for it.
no, sentience is just the complexity. When
I
something is
so again this is where we
when
disagree.
okay, so some when a multicellular process is complex up to a certain level, where we confirm it as sentient. It's just that sentience is just complex process between cells.
Okay, I mean
Yeah.
that's like I don't know if that's true though because every time I've seen sentience described, it's always or at least the way I use it is again having like a level of like an experience of a subjective reality, and that's not something that plants do as far as we're aware. And I think it would take a lot
I,
of
I think
convincing.
that I think that the confusion here comes from the fact that you know the idea of consciousness overwhelms us.
The
We
idea,
don't quite understand
wait,
that.
sorry, the idea of
You know,
consciousness over what? Sorry.
the you know we I don't think we have ever quite understood the idea of consciousness. we can't quite emulate it. But when you think about it in biological terms, it's just a really complex sum of cell interactions. It's just so complex that you cannot put it on paper.
Sure,
You cannot
I
think
don't.
about it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but we aren't really talking about the biological. Again, we're not really talking about the biology of it. We're talking about the philosophy. So I would separate the two subjects in saying that biology is what causes us to think in the way we do. Biology is what allows our cells to work in conjunction so that they can create incredibly
Yes,
complex
and
organisms
and,
like
and
us.
the sentience and the sentience part is the product of that simple biology done over and over and over again.
I don't know if
Once you
I
do
would.
it too many times,
See, this is the thing though. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, and I don't really know too much about the academics that have spoken about this, and I'd be interested to read some. But my point is that basically, I think when we speak of sentience, or when I speak of sentience, at least I'm speaking in the purely philosophical sense of being able to experience a level of reality. Like, I just don't see how you could ever equate plants on the same level, even close to as animals or humans in that sense. And I mean,
so
even like I said, even if I want to give you that argument and just say, sure, plants are sentient to a degree, I still don't see the justification for killing a cow over a plant when you could eat the plants, just eat the plants instead. Like, and it causes less harm total. I don't like if you want to make the utilitarian argument, I think you can, but just why not just eat the plants then? It just doesn't make much sense.
I mean, what makes you think that eating a plant causes less damage than eating a cow?
Well, I mean,
And
okay. Do you not think that cows experience more suffering than plants?
I think they do, and we we try to minimize it.
I mean,
We,
this is the thing though. If you're okay, so my question would be, if you truly believe that cows experience a similar level of suffering as plants do, then why do we try to minimize cow suffering and we don't try to minimize plant suffering?
I don't know. I
I
mean,
mean, I think you know the answer. I think it's because they don't suffer as much. Like, I
if
feel this
you
is really basic.
look, look, if you left it to me, you know, I I would feel kind of very slightly disturbed when a lot of people have problems when they see somebody crushing a plant. People say, stop that, what are you doing? It's got to grow.
Okay, so I would
you,
argue that a lot of.
I look,
Sorry,
I
sorry, go
think
on.
you might misunderstand me here, so I'm going to clarify
Yeah, sure,
something.
sure, sure. Go ahead.
Listen, what I'm trying to say is that we do understand that plants grow, they want to keep growing. What we don't understand is you know pretty much the same thing because we can't quite relate to them. It comes back to relating to another species.
Okay,
We have been with dogs, we have been with horses. Plants are so different from us that we cannot process how they might feel, and even I can only take this so far logically. I don't know how plants feel, so even I cannot relate to them.
okay, sure, I understand that, but again, my point is that, like, surely we should go off our best knowledge. Like, from our best knowledge, we can clearly see that, like, as far as we're aware, okay, less suffering is derived from biological processes. One of the biggest kind of factors as to whether you experience like a level of pain or suffering or fear or any of those kind of negative emotions is a central nervous system. So what does a plant have that's the equivalent of a central nervous system that allows them to experience that level of suffering to the point where you would say it's at least even comparable with a cow? Like, what do they have that compares to that?
Okay, so it's not that, so whatever plants feel is not that complex, but the equivalent to the central nervous system that a cow would have is just a bunch of cells doing their thing. The function of a central nervous system is to you know take receive stimulus, process it, and send some signals back to carry out whatever processes are necessary. Now, when it comes to plants, they have much simpler structures, and they do take different kinds of stimulus. And in a study, I think it was the University of Missouri in Columbia, they did find that plants react differently to different kinds of insects when they eat them, and
So,
they would react differently to a caterpillar than just mechanical damage. So they do send different kinds of signals. They do process it somewhere, and they do send some signals back.
okay, I don't disagree that plants react to stimuli. I don't think this is anyone, and it's something that anyone disagrees on. But again, I constantly come back to the question of like, I just don't see how you can consider that even close to what a cow feels. And I mean, like, if you want to say that, if you want to just throw everything out the window and just say that, for example, like every life effectively is as important as every other. And I understand what you mean by that in a philosophical sense. You're saying that, like, why should our experiences be more important than that of another species, right? I understand kind of to an extent what you mean there. But then, by that logic, what's the difference in your head between killing, like, an ant and killing, like, a primate that is incredibly close on the evolutionary chain to us? In your mind, that would be the same. And I just think that's completely absurd.
Okay, so like I said earlier, completely, when you're okay, so this brings us back to that part where we talked about companionship and relating to each other. So in so if we were okay, so let's assume that we have no evolutionary history or history as a civilization
Yep,
whatsoever.
sure.
If we somehow suddenly popped on Earth out of nowhere, each one of us, we would have no reason to feel for each other or not kill each other. But
So,
because we do have a history, we have multiple kinds of histories, and you know because we have them, because we have had those historical experiences, we you know as an be it as an evolutionary mechanism or as something that as symbiosis, we that leads us to feel for some organisms and not others.
okay, I understand why we relate to certain people, but again, this is my point. Like, it seems like you're drawing moral worth from being able to relate to people. What about okay? What about in circumstances where cultures have had mutated children, not been able to relate to them, and as a result decided to, like kill that child or consider them the devil and shun them from society? Why you wouldn't consider that moral? I would imagine. So why is relating to something important when speaking about moral worth?
Okay, hold on a second. Just
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I guess he's gone for a sec. Bloody hell, y'all are going wild in chat. Uh, oh jeez, I don't even know if I want to go through all this. It's like a lot. What is the difference? Oh, sorry. What is the similarity between a Christmas tree and a priest? The balls are just for decoration. Yeah, I can't disagree, buddy. Oil will separate from water.
hey,
Is the
hey,
water
can
sense?
you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got you.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
Oh, you've gone robot, buddy.
So
Sorry. Just for anyone listening, his connection isn't fantastic, so he's kind of gone a little bit.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, yep. I've got you.
Okay, so I, I had a blackout, and I had to find a better place, and I just found a nice spot for the network. So
No worries.
so where were we?
Um, Oh, I can't exactly remember. I think we were talking about. Yeah, sorry. So you were saying how I was basically saying it seems weird to me that you draw moral value based on evolution and society and how much we can quote unquote relate to
Okay,
something.
okay, so yes, I remember about the child.
Yeah.
About the child. Okay, so this brings us to that evolutionary process that we're supposed to look after our offsprings and help them grow up and reproduce further. It
Yeah.
brings us to everything that evolution has ingrained within us.
Okay, yeah, but my point is, if our evolution goes against what we want, so for example, if like our evolution says, you know, oh, this child is very different, and we're amazing at pattern recognition. This is something that's actually allowed our species to survive a very long time. Pattern recognition has been paramount to our survival. So, if our evolution says recognizes a pattern of what a healthy child is, sees a child in, so go back like 300 years, we see a child that's mutated. It's got a fourth arm or something. Oh, sorry, a third arm or something. And then all of a sudden, society condemns it as the devil and shuns it. Would you consider that moral because we can't relate to it and our evolution has gone against that child?
Okay, so I wouldn't. Okay, so there are two parts to it. There are two sides to this. I wouldn't. The first reason I wouldn't accept this is because you're calling the child they would be calling the child a devil, and you're trying to shun a child based simply on superstition.
Yeah,
Now the second part to this is, if you look at the natural, if you look at other animals, a lot of them would raise their kids casually, and they wouldn't cater to any special requirements. If a child is mutated and it needs something more, it needs something different from other children to survive, other species wouldn't do it. Now as humans, have, to a certain extent, even though I mentioned that we are held back by how we are limited biologically, we have grown out of nature in a certain way into science and art. We have been exploring the world around us. We have kind of
oh no, I've lost you, buddy. It was good for a moment.
okay.
No, not quiet. Almost for a second there, but no.
How,
Um, I think we've lost him. But I mean, as what I would say, just quickly to chat, what I would say to what he was claiming is that it seems like he's drawing an arbitrary line. He's basically saying that evolution is important, and that's why we see each other as companions and we relate to each other. However, in the circumstance of our evolution going against us and us rejecting this child, be it out of superstition or whatever, I would consider that to be. It just seems like a very false claim. It doesn't seem like it matches up. Like he's basically saying like evolution is good up to a point, but then if we reject a child out of evolution, then I would be against that because I would see it as immoral. Like it seems like a conflicting statement. I agree with the rip, Nath. I think this kid is. I don't know if we're getting this guy back. Ripperoonie, is this Ripperoonie? This might be Ripperoonie. I'll be kind of sad. I've actually enjoyed this chat a lot. Like, I mean, it was a bit monotonous and circular at points. It's a bit of a shame, but I mean, it is kind of how these discussions go a lot of the time. There were 14 people here watching Darkest Dungeon last week. Yeah, they are. Could you hear anything? Not anymore, buddy. He's just messaged me on Facebook. Where the hell is my Facebook? There it is. Yeah, I've got nothing. And I think this might be the end. Oh, the end, friendos. Whatever shall I do? Call again? I mean, I guess we could try. I mean, I'd like to keep this discussion going. Yeah, let's give this another shot. So, join call. Hello? Hello? Nah, I'm getting nothing. We might just have to call it here, friendos. This is a sad time. Oh, you're back. No?
okay.
Oh, you're back. There we go. There we go.
Okay, does this sound good?
Yeah, it sounds fine. So basically, my point is that it seems like you're rejecting evolution when it's convenient, but you're saying that our evolution allows us to value each other, and it just seems like a conflicting point of view.
So, what I'm trying to say is that evolution gives us a lot of reasons to care for some species, and it limits in a way that we cannot care for other species, we have to kill them. Now, what
Sorry,
we're
buddy.
constantly trying to do.
I can't understand. You're roboting like crazy. Is I mean, is there a?
Hey, I'm a little stuttering.
Oh, that might be a bit better.
Okay, is this good?
Yep, I think so.
Okay, so I'm trying to say is that evolution, where at at sometimes evolution gives us some reasons to care for certain species when we are in symbiosis or if it's our own, and in some ways it pulls us back into, you know, killing certain species because of the way we are
Uh,
limited biologically.
okay, so would you
Okay,
agree
so
then?
so
So yeah, so just quickly, would you agree then that evolution in itself doesn't really tell you? It doesn't really tell you whether something's good or bad. It just is. Would you agree with that?
okay, yeah, you're right there. Evolution doesn't tell us anything. So in some cases, like choosing between a dog or a chicken. Hey Devin, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. Go on.
Okay, so in some cases, like choosing between eating a dog or eating a chicken, it can provide us with some resources to draw a line, but it's not the right way after all. So
Yeah. So
it's
okay.
evolution.
S-
Evolution is also pulling us back, and we're constantly trying to escape that in forms of science and in forms of trying to show compassion to to various kinds of things, to various species where we can. But in some ways, we just can't feed on sunlight. That's where we have to go back to evolution for some guidelines to
Okay. Okay.
where we
I just
can
I
draw a
really want
line.
to hone in on this point. I really want to hone in on this point because you've actually pretty much said it for me. So you've just said that evolution doesn't always tell us what is right. It just sometimes guides us, and we sometimes need to go back to it, and sometimes we don't. Now, I would suggest that this is because appealing to evolution is not a valid argument to do anything. For example, you wouldn't say that because we've evolved to do a certain thing, we shouldn't necessarily do it. And I mean, I'm sure you can find lots of examples of this in nature. I can't really think of any off the top of my head, but my point is that as evolution, in and of itself, doesn't tell you whether we should or shouldn't do something, you can't really use it as a reason to do something unless there's another reason entirely separate. So, for example, a time when you might say we should do this because of evolution, you'd say we should eat a diet that is similar to what we have done evolutionarily because it's what we're evolved to do. But the reason we eat that diet isn't because of evolution, it's because of the biology we've developed as a result of evolution. But fundamentally, it's because of the biology. So this is my kind of issue with the evolution argument. Do you understand? Like, it just seems you can't appeal to evolution because it doesn't tell you
Okay,
whether
so
something's good or bad. Does
so
that make sense?
yes, that makes a lot of sense. And
Cool.
so evolution is certainly not the right way to to look for guidance, and we're constantly trying to escape that. Now,
Okay.
when we hit a roadblock, when we cannot go further, when we're confused, oh my God, what do I eat? I cannot eat sunlight. We have to look back to draw lines, and it's a sad thing, but we have to do it.
But
We
this
have
is the
to
thing.
draw a line somewhere and form biases.
But this is just the thing. I don't think evolution tells us what we should and shouldn't eat. I think logic dictates that. So, for example, we can say that these foods are healthy, these foods are unhealthy, and that's what we should probably eat. There are other factors like ethics, which is why obviously like me and various others, argue for veganism. But ultimately, it's got nothing to do with evolution as to where we look to eat. We just look at logic. We, approach a biologist or a nutritionalist and say, what should I eat? What gives me, like, I don't know, the carbs I need, the protein I need, and the fats I need, and the various, like, macronutrients. Like, it's got nothing to do with evolution per se. It's got way more to do with the underlying biological things. So, again, I just find it very strange how you've gone back to evolution time and time again, despite the fact that evolution really doesn't tell you all that much. It's relevant from a historical point of view, and it's interesting from a historical point of view, but in terms of forming ethics
Okay,
and diet, it doesn't really tell us a whole lot.
okay. So the the logical point of view says, if you move according to the logical point of view, you would hit a roadblock you where you'll go, oh my God, what do I eat? I've
I,
said this before, but
but this is the thing, I don't think that's necessarily true. Like, you say we'll hit a roadblock, but I mean, where are we going to hit the roadblock? Like, we're just
how
going to
do
keep eating
you
plants.
logically how do you logically decide what to feed on? If you're going by what's ethical,
Okay, so
you cannot
if you go,
feed
but this is the thing. If you go by what's ethical, it's quite simple. I mean, even if I extend to you that plants are worthy of moral consideration, which again, I don't even agree with that necessarily. But let's just say I do. It's you'd want to reduce harm. You'd want to cause as little suffering as possible. And by eating the plants directly, you're causing less harm than eating a cow and plants. Like, because if you eat the cow, you have to feed the cow plants, and those plants are suffering as a result of the cow. If you eat the plants direct, basically what I'm trying to say is you cause less harm
Okay,
if
so you think that when you're eating a cow, you're causing additional suffering to the plants that the cow has already caused suffering to?
yes, absolutely. How could you not? How could
How
you
does
argue
that
against
work?
that?
How does that work? Because if the cow has already eaten the plants,
Okay, so
they've already suffered and died, they've been digested.
okay,
All you are
let me give
doing
you
is,
let me sorry, just let me give you two. I think I can explain this because I know what you're trying to say, and I just think it's so patently false. It's really obvious to me. So what I'm trying to say is you have two different worlds. In one world, you breed a cow into existence. This cow is raised and it eats a bunch of crops, causing harm to the crops, and then you kill it and eat it, causing harm to the cow. In another world, you would never have bred that cow into existence and you eat the crops directly, and you would eat less crops than had you eaten the cow in terms of efficiency. So, for example, you would get, like, say, 2,000 calories out of a cow for if the cow eats this many crops and you eat the cow. That's this much suffering. If you eat the crops directly, you can get 2,000 calories out of a lot less crops than it would be if you ate the cow. Does that make sense? If in one world the cow never existed, so ultimately it causes less suffering. I don't. It's just so. This just seems like such an
okay, so
apparent thing.
uh, okay, so it's another story when the cow does not exist. If the cow does not exist, there's no additional harm to the crops, then you can reduce the suffering. But in a world where cows exist, the cow eats crops regardless of whether you eat other crops or you eat the cow. So
Okay.
you still have the choice between the crops and the cow, and you won't be causing any additional damage in either case.
Okay. So I agree with you. If the cow already exists, you're not causing additional damage. But then I would just go and say that's not how the world works. Like, supply and demand is a thing. If the consumer base says I want to eat cow, people are going to breed more cows into existence. So we could have the alternative world in which the cows never existed. If we choose to eat less cows, there will be less cows in existence to fill the demand because the demand will be less. Like that, surely you can see that that's exactly the world we're living. That's the exact dichotomy we're on.
Okay, so if you reduce the demand for cows, the demand for crops will increase. That's pretty simple.
Yeah, yeah, but
You're gonna have to do something.
this goes back to what I was saying earlier. How when you eat the cows, it's less efficient than eating the crops directly. If you want to reduce harm in the world in which the cow doesn't exist, you eat 2,000 calories worth of crops, and that is way less suffering
Okay,
than if you eat 2,000 calories in cow.
I think we're going in circles.
I think we are going in circles, but I feel like I've almost got a concession on this. I feel I'm so close. I really feel like I do because, like, you've already okay. Let me just summarize this real quick. You've already agreed that in the world in
Okay.
which the cow didn't exist, we would cause less harm and less suffering. So, if we choose to eat less cows, that means that we will have that world in which the cow never existed in the first place. So, by that logic, we could have the world in which less harm is done. And again, this is all assuming plants even are worth moral consideration. Like, do you see the point? Does that make sense? Because I really feel like this is a really clear, like almost mathematical equation. It's just very, it seems very clear to me.
Okay, so I had a little stuttering from your side.
Okay.
It's probably my own network, but okay, let me try to let me let me ask you if this is what you meant.
Go ahead.
So you are saying that in a world where cows don't exist, if you eat the plant, you're causing less suffering.
Yes.
Does that end there,
Yep.
or
Precisely.
is it? So that ends there, right?
Yeah. Pretty much.
So in a world where cows do exist, you eat the crop, then eats the cows eat more crop.
But this is what I'm saying. I'm saying if we eat the crops directly, we will have no need to eat the cow, and thus less cows will exist. Do you like? I'm sure you understand supply and demand. Just makes perfect sense, right?
Okay, can you say that again?
Sure. So, if we eat the crops directly and we choose not to eat the cow, less cows will exist, and thus we'll have the world in which there are less cows and less harm done to crops. Does that make sense?
I don't I don't understand what you're trying to say.
What I'm trying to say is, if we because of the way supply and demand works, if we choose to eat the crops
Okay,
directly.
okay, just give me a moment. I will try to go to a place
Oh,
where the
sure, it's
network
the
is.
connection. Okay, sure, sure, sure. Oh, I think we're close. I think we're close. I think he's nearly understanding what I'm saying. I don't know if he'll necessarily agree, but I do think we're close to at least getting this across. I'll move on to Darkest Dungeon soon, guys. I don't know who's here for Darkest Dungeon necessarily, but we'll definitely be starting that soon. I know we're gone a bit over time, but I kind of expected this. Like, he had said he had to go in about an hour and a half, which is why I changed this. But yeah. No, no, no. Continue this. I mean, Nick, I've got a schedule, man. I got to keep to it. Nobody wants to watch that game. I agree. What a shite game. Who plays Darkest Dungeon, right? Fuck that game. What a piece of shit game. Maybe I should just move straight on to Battle Right. Admittedly, Battle Right is really fun. I've been having so much fun with it. But yeah. Are we good, buddy? Buddy? Oh no, it looks like he's still trying to find connect. Oh,
Okay, does it sound good?
oh, that's a robot. The robot's come out. It's pretty roboty.
Uh, okay, let me. Okay, how about this?
Okay, that's better. Can you hear me? Okay.
I'm I'm still trying to figure out. Okay,
Sure.
okay, this should be good, right?
Sure. I can hear you. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay, I can hear you. Okay, as
Sure.
well.
So
Okay.
what I was trying to say is that if you agree that the world in which the cows didn't exist, there is less suffering, in that case, as a result of supply and demand, if we eat the crops directly, we will have that world in which there are less cows and thus less harm being caused overall. Do you see the connection there?
I see the connection, but only and only in a world where either cows don't exist or in a world where cows exist and they feed on sunlight.
Okay, but this is what I'm saying. We can have this. Okay, obviously you'll never have a world where cows don't exist. Period. But I am sure you agree that in a world where you have less cows, there is going to be less suffering because they're eating less crops, and we eat the crops directly. That the cows that would have existed had we eaten the meat would have existed. Does that make? That was a bit scatterbrained, admittedly. So that I may have to rephrase that. Did you get that?
Can you repeat the last part?
Sure, yeah, that was a little scatterbrained. I don't know if that was a proper sentence I was using.
Yes.
Basically, what I'm saying is that in a world, like if you agree that less cows means less suffering, then in a world in which we can reduce the cow population to what it probably would be naturally, and have like, I mean, look, at the end of the day, we have something like fuck. I need to go look up. They're saying like 1 billion cows on the planet. It's absurd. It's a really
Yeah,
large number.
yes, I understand what you're trying to say.
Sure. So if we reduce
There,
that population down to say 100,000 and release them back into the wild, I don't even know if it'd be that much, but let's say we did that, then we would eat the crops directly, and thus the 900,000 cows that would have existed if we continued eating the meat wouldn't exist, so there would be less suffering.
Okay, so here are you assuming that cows and crops suffer the same, or are you
I
assuming that there's
even
a
if they
difference?
even if they do even if they do suffer the same, it would still be less suffering
Okay,
because we would eat less.
so even okay, so look at it like this. There are four entities, okay? There are just four entities on Earth. There's one human, one cow, one crop, and another crop, two crops. Okay, two crops, one cow, one human.
One
Okay,
cow, one
so
human, two crops. That's four entities. Yep.
okay, so human eats crop. Okay, you see
Yep.
that? Human eats crop, one crop's God. We have three entities. What does the cow do to survive? Cow eats crop.
Sure. We have two entities.
We have two entities left. Two are already gone. Now, in a scenario where the human eats the cow, we will still have two entities left because cow eats crop, human eats cow. We still have one human and one crop.
Uh,
It's just replaced by a crop and a cow.
okay. Sure. But my point is, if like, firstly, the cow wouldn't eat just one crop, and secondly, even in that example, cow needs to grow to survive. So cow eats crop. Human needs to eat crop to survive, then actually let's forget that. Okay, instead of eating the crop, let's say the human eats the cow. When you eat the cow, you're causing harm to two entities as opposed to the one if you just ate the crop. So can you not see how that's already causing more suffering?
So you're not causing harm to two entities. You are directly causing harm to one entity, and the one crop that the cow ate would be eaten by the cow regardless of whether or not you eat the cow.
Yes, but the cow wouldn't exist if we didn't breed it into existence. Like, this is my point. Like, if you don't have a
Okay,
demand for the,
okay, I see that. That's where you make sense.
yeah. So how can you not see? So yeah, if you agree with that, then yeah, surely you can see that eating the
So
crops directly causes
so
less harm. This is just yeah.
so there there actually is another side to that. Now now I haven't looked, I haven't thought too much about breeding and stuff, so I cannot have a comment on that. But if you're looking at a cow existing, if it weren't for that cow, something else would exist, and
No,
we'd
but
have to work with that.
I don't think that's true. If we stopped eating the cows
Because
wouldn't exist. In fact, like look at it this way, right? If you go back, if you go back,
it would exist as one of its ancestors.
no, but this is what I'm saying. I don't think that's true. If you were to go back, say, I don't know, even 100 years, we wouldn't even have close to the animal population we have now. These animals wouldn't have existed naturally. Nothing was there to replace them. It was purely because we've bred them into existence so we can eat the meat.
Okay, I see you making sense there. You're right about that. I
Thank
agree
you.
with you on that.
Sure. So, yeah. So this is kind of the crux of my argument. And again, this is all
Yeah,
assuming
yeah,
that plants are even worth considering.
so the farming part, I think you make sense there. We are breeding we are breeding living beings and then causing damage. But you know, farming is completely different argument. I'll have to think about that.
Cool. I mean, I think I'm going to call it here because we've gone over just a tiny bit. I need to get to Darkest Dungeon and continue the stream. But I'm really glad we've had this conversation. I actually really appreciate it. I hope I haven't like been too I don't know aggressive or whatever. Like I feel like it's been a relatively civil
No,
discussion.
no, no. I don't think you have been aggressive.
Cool.
You,
Yeah.
you're quite.
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate the discussion. I mean, if you ever want to come back on and discuss this further after thinking about the point that I've just brought up, feel free to like drop me a PM or whatever. I'd be happy to have this discussion again.
I'll make sure the network works out.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fair enough. Cool. All right.
I'm really sorry for that.
Don't worry about it.
This
It's
was
fine.
fun.
Sorry. Go on. What was you going to say? Sorry.
I was saying this was fun, and thank you for this.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Again, thank you very much. I agree, it was fun. I've had a good time, so I've enjoyed the conversation. But yeah,
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
cool. All right, well, I'll see you around, dude. Stay safe and whatnot. Yeah, I'll see you about. Bye.
You too. See you later.
All right, I actually think that went reasonably well. It seems like we got a bit of a concession at the end. I don't know if like he'll go away and think about that and then give me an actual reason as to kind of the counter argument or not. But yeah, that was pretty good, honestly. Has anyone give a summary? So basically, his argument was that we can't distinguish between plants and animal suffering, which again I don't even necessarily agree with because sentience is very important here. Um, but basically, yeah, like this was what he was trying to do, and I think it's a stretch. I don't think most people would agree with it. In fact, I think you can just prove that just by clearly seeing that people don't treat animals. Don't treat plants as if they, should be harvested humanely or whatever. We just harvest them, right? Like, I mean, I'm not. That's not necessarily an indicator they don't suffer as such, but I think it's very. There's no scientist that can, show you any reason to morally consider plants, and I just don't see. I think it would take a lot to convince me otherwise. But yeah, that was pretty much a summary of his position. Mine was the opposite, and even if I got even like, the last half of that conversation was me basically saying, okay, fine, let's say plants suffer equivalent to animals. If we eat the plants directly, we're causing less suffering overall. So what's your argument against that? And it seemed like in the end he kind of came around to that point of view. Like it seemed like he eventually understood what I was trying to say. So that's really good. I've actually recorded this. I'm gonna throw it up on YouTube as well. So I'll stop the recording here. So peace out, YouTube.